Right, thank you for that excellent introduction. Yep, I'm not yet a professor, but have my viva in January, so we will see. Travelled here from Oxford, and I'm going to be talking, though, about a, I think, somewhat distinctively American form of illiberalism and how we can respond to it. So there was an excellent article in the HXA magazine by John Thomasy, which some of you may have seen, called What Mill and Marcuse Can Teach Us About Trump. Now, we have this lovely image here of Marcuse and Mill looking like Trump's sort of two angels tempting him to good or evil decisions. But what I'm going to suggest today is that in some respects, Mill and Marcuse were on the same side. And this is at least a plausible reading of the two thinkers. And this is going to have implications for how we interpret and respond to what I've called the post-liberal challenge to academic freedom. So, according to all kinds of popular commentators from all parts of the political spectrum, we're currently living in a post-liberal moment. Liberalism, according to some, has failed. It's reached an apotheosis. It's reached its apogee. It's also, in some sense, collapsing. But there's a distinctive ideology of post-liberalism promoted by a particularly vociferous group of public intellectuals that I am going to be discussing today. And this ideology of post-liberalism, I use ideology in a non-pejorative sense, is one of the motivating factors, one of the underlying ideas behind some of the current administration's attacks on universities. Whatever we think of those policies, they're motivated in part by this post-liberal ideology. And I take it the core belief of this post-liberalism, at least the post-liberal thinkers that I'm interested in, is the idea there is a kind of zero-sum conflict between what we might call traditionalist and progressive views of human flourishing. So if traditionalism says that the human good is in some way linked to something transcendent that is beyond humans' individual desires, whether that be explicitly religious or otherwise. Progressivism is the opposite view. It's what Alan Bloom called value positing, that you invent your own values, you arbitrarily declare things are of value, and then the good is the fulfillment of whatever you happen autonomously to value. It's radical autonomy, it's the belief that the good is self-expression. So J.D. Vance calls himself a member of the post-liberal right. We have here three of the most well-known post-liberal public intellectuals, Patrick Deneen, Adrian Vermeule, and Yoram Hazony. There are differences between the three. Vermeule calls himself an integralist. That's the radical form of post-liberalism, holding that the Catholic Church should reclaim its right to authorize the state to enforce canon law on baptized Christians, including, in principle, the enforcement of laws against heresy, apostasy, and blasphemy. So that's a particularly radical version of post-liberalism. Deneen, who does not endorse this, is another Catholic post-liberal who is anti-liberal, but in a more generic, more ecumenical sense, perhaps takes positions that were not alien to the sort of traditional old-fashioned religious right. Yoram Hazony, the leader of the National Conservative Movement, who has also called on the state to have a greater role in promoting religion and family in public life, but not with such a schematic model like integralism or something as blatantly coercive. Now, I'm going to be looking at a particular part of post-liberalism. I'm not evaluating the whole ideology, but just to get some context there. And the basic methodology I take here is that we should treat their ideas not as lurid oddities, but as if they might be true. So the logic of post-liberalism is encapsulated by what Kevin Vallier calls the no alternatives argument. Although it draws on older strands of anti-liberal thought within conservatism, it makes what I take to be a relatively new claim. The no alternatives argument says that a stable regime of liberal pluralism is impossible. It will inevitably decay into progressive authoritarianism, the imposition of progressive values in a coercive way. And so there are really only two possible outcomes long term. Either you have progressive authoritarianism or you have traditionalist authoritarianism. So if you are a traditionalist, if you're a social and religious conservative, obviously you're going to think, well, it's better to have us doing the authoritarianism than the other side. So the no alternatives argument creates this zero-sum mentality. Now, it applies to academic freedom. So the post-liberals will say that because of this surge in progressive censorship in the academy, so the The blue line there measures censorship attempts from the left. We can see it was higher for a while, and then after October 7th, it sort of reversed. But what's perhaps more significant, of course, is self-censorship, which is not these dramatic but numerically small incidents of cancellation, but simply the fact that scholars on the right are far more likely to say they self-censor. That isn't necessarily because scholars on the left are more censorious. The research on this often suggests it's just because of numerical preponderance. Inevitably, the minority is going to feel more pressure to self-censor. But post-liberals interpret this as evidence in the academic domain of a version of the no alternatives argument. There is this tendency of facially neutral, facially liberal institutions to decay into progressive authoritarianism. So, as I said at the start, are Mill and Marcuse in some sense on the same side? Well, according to Deneen, they are. So although the defenders, and we've heard Mill mentioned many times throughout the programming over the last few days, of academic freedom will invoke Mill's famous dictum that only through diversity of opinion is there, in the existing state of human intellect, a chance of fair play to all sides of the truth. The post-liberals think that there is a direct link between this claim of Mill's and the notorious claim by Marcuse in Repressive Tolerance that we cannot give official tolerance to the right as well as to the left, to the party of hate as well as that of humanity. So how do they draw this conclusion? Well, the post-liberals ask, what is the object, what is the purpose of academic freedom? And when they ask this question, it appears to be what we might call a genealogical critique. They're saying, where does this concept come from? So, according to Deneen, this left-wing cancel culture is the very object of academic freedom because, he says, academic freedom was invented by people like Mill to advance a set of substantive commitments that were implicit in the liberal conception of freedom. That's roughly the progressive conception. You do you, live your best life. Human flourishing is self-expression, which is directly opposed to the classical and Catholic understanding. It's not just Catholic, it's most traditional conceptions of human flourishing would have had a view of freedom that required some kind of self-control or self-discipline and orientation towards higher goods. So, according to this sort of genealogical argument, Mill only ever advanced his case for academic freedom and for freedom more generally and free speech more generally because he intended it specifically to displace traditional forms of culture. Freedom of speech was supposed to protect experiments in living by progressive minorities. It was not supposed to protect conservative views as and when progressives had the power to censor them. So Mill's whole rationale for free expression, according to this genealogical argument, was contingent on it achieving its goal of advancing substantively progressive views. So Vermeulen takes up this thread and says, well, Marcuse explicitly takes himself to be carrying Mill's project to its logical conclusion. He cites Mill's discussion of children and so-called barbarians to argue that that truth is the end of liberty, the goal of liberty, but by truth here we mean Mill's view of what is true, that flourishing consists of self-expression and experiments in living. So we get these substantive progressive beliefs. And so, according to the post-liberals, we go from Mill's premises to Marcuse's chilling conclusion. The restoration of freedom, Marcuse says, of thought may necessitate new and rigid restrictions on teachings and practices in the educational institutions. Freedom is slavery. Therefore, we'll never be able to have academic freedom, according to the post-liberals, because the classic arguments for academic freedom presuppose this particular substantive view of the human good. Vermeulen sort of radicalizes this claim, all human conflict is ultimately theological. And so the only question, if you accept this argument, is, well, are we going to deny and conceal that we have a substantive view we're trying to enforce through the rhetoric of academic freedom, or are we going to be open about it, open about the fact there's no alternative, open about the existential conflict that is involved? So, are the post-liberals right? Well, first of all, historically, genealogically, I think they have quite a plausible case with regards to Mill. So Maurice Cowling's analysis of Mill's liberalism, which is cited by both Deneen and Vermeulen, which I think is a very plausible and respectable analysis, does indeed show that Mill's project was intended to advance this substantively progressive view of human flourishing. Mill envisaged a national clerisy, a kind of established church without the religion that was going to serve the role that established churches played in illiberal confessional states, but on the other side, to advance progressivism and be a repository of wisdom for a progressive nation. So it's a liberal project designed to achieve this very substantive goal. And Marcuse indeed does cite Mill in this notorious essay on repressive tolerance, and he does actually explicitly take himself to be continuing Mill's project. So genealogically, it's very plausible the post-liberals are right. The question then is, how should we respond? Now, first of all, let's think about the actual arguments that are then being advanced for academic freedom today, and which of them might be vulnerable to this critique. Because we can't just assume, we can't make a kind of genealogical fallacy and assume that because academic freedom was invented for such a purpose, it has to always serve that purpose now. So there are some rationales for academic freedom that do seem to fall victim to the post-liberal critique. The kind of rationale that says something like, well, the reason that we need free speech and academic freedom is because you look at history, it's always been the minorities, the oppressed, the marginalized who've benefited from this academic freedom and free speech to overturn oppressive structures, to overturn traditional beliefs, and to bring about a more progressive society. Now, that might be true, and it might be perfectly valid for progressives to say this as an internal, as it were, progressive argument for academic freedom. I don't begrudge progressives that in any way. But I do think it has two extremely important limitations that the post-liberals make us aware of. First of all, it has no appeal to traditionalists or social and religious conservatives to say, well, academic freedom's the whole reason we have gay marriage in the first place, doesn't have any force to those who don't support gay marriage. Equally, it might actually have the opposite effect on traditionalists and social and religious conservatives, because it may suggest to them that academic freedom is, in fact, just a means to promote substantive values that they don't approve of, as the post-liberals have been saying. So, at very least, these arguments seem to need supplementing by other arguments that don't appeal specifically, or explicitly or implicitly, to these progressive beliefs about human flourishing. We need reasons why those who have traditionalist views should themselves support academic freedom for reasons based in their own views. As I said, just because Mill's argument was bad or relied on premises that are dubious, just because it has these troubling implications, doesn't mean that every argument that appeals to academic freedom as a means of promoting truth will necessarily share the same flaw. Even if the arguments are inspired by Mill, genealogy isn't necessarily destiny. It doesn't mean we can't develop arguments that are neutral. The question, however, would then be, well, what would a case for academic freedom that is genuinely neutral, that doesn't take any position on progressive versus traditionalist views of flourishing, look like, and how could we develop and strengthen such an argument? So it seems to me the best way to respond to the post-liberals is to appeal to the value of epistemic humility. Now, this is a rationale for academic freedom that's going to be limited to certain domains, the humanities and social sciences, to morally and politically charged fields. It's not going to be necessary to make this kind of argument in technical disciplines. Now, I think we can, although the post-liberals are fiercely critical of rules and rulesians, and they think the idea of a neutral state is a mask and a sham for the same kind of progressive authoritarianism that I've been discussing, I think there are insights in rules that we can take and that are useful, whether we agree with his bigger project or not. And one of these is the idea of the burdens of judgment. So these are epistemic burdens that people face, particularly when thinking about the true, the good, and the beautiful. What is human flourishing? What are the ultimate goals, ends, and values in human life? So Rawls points out that our concepts are vague. Our judgment is inevitably affected by our overall life experience. It's difficult to weight the different kinds of consideration that are found on both sides of nearly all complex questions. Considerations about duties versus utility, for example, and it's hard to assess which ones are most important and when. And all these things suggest reasons for an attitude of epistemic humility when thinking about the human good. Whatever our substantive beliefs, whether they're progressive, traditionalists, or whatever, we shouldn't have an attitude that we are so certain of our views about religious, metaphysical questions, about community, about the human mind, about family, sexuality, that we're confident enough to think that we don't benefit from hearing alternatives. We should, because of these burdens of judgment, entertain enough doubt about these beliefs, whatever they may be, to hold that they can always be improved by engaging with the presentation of the best possible arguments against them. So is this then Mill without Marcuse? Are we just extricating a certain insight from Mill without the kind of progressive belief that Mill based it on, and therefore stopping the logical journey from Mill to Marcuse, cutting that off. Well, yes, that's exactly what I think we should be doing. So this claim made by Mill that to refuse a hearing to an opinion because someone is sure it is false is to assume that their certainty is the same thing as absolute certainty is to be rescued from this progressive teleology in which Mill situated it, that we can accept this claim irrespective of whether we're progressives, traditionalists, or whatever. All we have to do to accept this claim is just to recognize the burdens of judgment that I mentioned earlier. Now, we need to recognize, however, that this logic applies equally symmetrically to the progressive beliefs about human flourishing that Marcuse took for granted, as it does to any other beliefs that we might care to mention. So this is it's a symmetrical, it's a content-neutral argument that applies equally to both sides in these disputes about the good. And so where I think we should end up here is, well, post-liberals, as I said earlier, we should look at their ideas not as lurid oddities, but as if they could be true. I don't think their conclusions are necessarily true, but I do think they draw attention to very important problems, and they have a lot of valuable insights. So they claim that academic freedom is a ruse to promote progressive ideology. They appeal to this genealogical argument tracing Marcuse's ideas back to Mill. That's a plausible genealogy. It's a plausible historical claim. The post-liberals conclude that there is no alternative to the imposition of some set of values or other, that someone's going to be using the law to humiliate the other side, and that this applies to academic freedom, that there's no really neutral conception of this. One side or the other is going to enforce their values. Now, the basic idea that I want to get across today then is that we should be wary of attaching all of our, placing all of the emphasis in making the case for academic freedom to ideas or arguments that implicitly appeal to the value of social progress. Not everyone believes that changes of the last 50 years have been uniformly positive. Some traditionalists like the post-liberals and like others who are not post-liberals believe that in some respects they amount to degeneration and decline in human flourishing. And those people also need to be convinced of the case for academic freedom. So it's fine for progressives to appeal to these things, to the value of self-expression when making the case for academic freedom among other progressives, but we also need arguments that are neutral, and I've suggested the best argument we're likely to find is the argument that appeals to epistemic uncertainty, the idea of the burdens of judgment, that whatever our substantive view is, whatever we personally think is the nature of the human good, we should always recognize the benefit of dialogue and discourse with the best arguments on the other side, and I think that this is the best way to respond to post-liberal claims about the superstition, as it were, of academic freedom. So I'll leave you with some references, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jacob. Our next speaker is Professor Ian SKOBLE from Bridgewater State University.
Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for staying till the end of the conference. So I'm Ian SKOBLE. I'm a professor of philosophy at Bridgewater State University. And also, you'll notice I put on there, I'm also the Bruce and Patricia Bartlett Chair in Free Speech and Expression. I don't mention that as a brag, but to sort of highlight the point of what I'm doing here today. For the last 3 years, it's been literally my job to both study and advocate those values. And so I'm interested, some of my work is more scholarly work about the concepts of free speech, but also I'm interested in, well, HXA-related things about how to create a better culture of free speech on campus. And so this particular thing today is a work in progress, but also part of a larger work in progress on how to make universities more welcoming, more cognizant of the ideals of free speech, open inquiry, and so on. And so what I was thinking was that, one of the things we have to do is articulate the positive case for freedom of expression. And you're all familiar with those if you're here. But everybody who's active in academic freedom, free speech type issues, obviously you have to find a way to engage with members of the campus community who don't share or explicitly repudiate those values. So it's not just a matter of saying, well, look, here's why free speech is good. This fellow over here is saying that it's bad. So I have to have some sort of direct response to this sort of person. And as a tactical matter, there's some reason to think that a constructive engagement is going to yield better benefits in the purely pragmatic sense of the word, no offense, Mike, than defensive or hostile approaches, okay? And that means that I have to understand why those people are the way they are. And so what I've figured out is that there's at least 5 types. I'm not wedded to there being 5, maybe there's more than 5, but I've identified at least 5 different types of people that are on campus who aren't really on board with free speech, academic freedom, open inquiry type principles, but they're not all opposed for the same reason. So if I'm going to be effective in my attempts to respond to or engage with them, I have to nail down more precisely what it is that motivates them to have that position that they have. So to begin with, administrators. So some administrators may in fact be ideologically committed to opposing free speech. They may have fully internalized the idea that their views are the correct views and anything else just does not deserve a place at a university. They may tolerate dissent about things that they think aren't important, but anything that they think is important, they're right about, and there's no point in having any academic freedom around those sorts of things, because from that point of view, it doesn't serve any constructive purpose. But I don't think most administrators are like that. Most administrators are just responding to the incentives that their jobs create. They are incentivized to maintain the importance of their job, to make it seem to the rest of the people in the administration that they have something important to do and that they need to keep doing it. And in general terms, they're trying to avoid getting flack. They don't want to get in trouble with donors. They don't want to have student mobs yelling at them. They don't want to have mobs of anybody yelling at them. They don't want anybody yelling at them. They also don't want bad media coverage. So they're incentivized, when they're incentivized by those sorts of things to be anti-free speech, then that's what they'll do. And it might not have anything to do with ideology, right? So they don't have to be these kind of people to act like those kind of people because they're incentivized by the structure of their positions in a bureaucratic university administration. We also have student groups, as some of you are aware. Some students have just internalized the words are violence idea, and they may genuinely believe that they have a right to prevent certain thoughts from being expressed because they're harmful. Many students have been coddled in the Haidt and Lukianoff sense, with which I'm sure you're all familiar, according to which it's detrimental to their well-being to have certain thoughts presented to them in the first place. And this is compounded by the fact that normal age college students are exactly at the age where they're zealots about whatever it is that they're into. They are absolutely convinced of the justice of their cause, whatever that might be. And, and this is both sides of the spectrum. Whether it's pro-life or pro-choice, for example, they're absolutely zealots about this stuff when they're 19 years old. And so if you combine that sort of age of zealotry with their having been brought up in certain ways, then you can see why certain students might oppose free speech sorts of issues. I guess another point that I didn't put on there is that in addition to the propensity for zealotry, there's also a lot of sort of sensitivity to peer pressure. So if they think that the other 6 students down their hall think a certain way, that gives them an incentive to at least act like they think a certain way. And that brings us to other faculty. Of course, you'd think that faculty would be the ones who are the most pro-academic freedom, but of course, it's not always like that. Some faculty, probably too many, have a free speech for me, but not for thee kind of an attitude. Their academic freedom is invaluable, but yours isn't. And this could be the result of a couple different things. One, it could be the result of sincerely believing that they have a responsibility to protect students from harm, and some expressions cause harm, and this is a sort of a counterpart to that one set of students who oppose free speech. Or they could actually see themselves primarily as activists as opposed to scholars. One model of the university professor is that, we're scholars, and then we impart knowledge to students and help them learn the tools for discovering truths themselves. But you've probably discovered that some faculty don't see themselves primarily that way, but rather as activists. They've discovered something which they now need to make sure that everybody else gets. And so education for those people consists in making sure that the students believe as I do. And so there's more of a substantive commitment to outcomes than merely procedural outcomes. So some faculty are going to be opposed to free speech for one of these two reasons. It's also worth noting that there are faculty who support academic freedom, but they won't say so publicly. I put silent majority in question mark because I hope it's a silent majority, but there's no way to tell because they're silent. But when you sometimes get these campus controversies come up, and then you post something about academic freedom or free speech or something, and you get 2 or 3 people complaining that you're wrong, and 2 or 3 people say that you're right, and then you get a couple of those private emails. I'm with you in spirit, but they don't actually want to join the fight. They don't want to say anything publicly. And so faculty self-censorship of this nature, it's hard not to see that as a failure of moral courage in some sense. But again, it can be incentive-driven. I'm picking my battles. I can't afford to alienate so-and-so. For example, I'm up for promotion this year, and so I don't want to piss off the dean too much. Or something like this, or I don't want my department chair to have a grudge against me or something like this. Or I don't want to be associated with either a person or a concept that might make me look bad. Even if I'm defending, to take a perfectly simple example, I might defend a student's right to wear a pro-life T-shirt, but then I might be afraid of saying that because I don't want people to think I'm pro-life myself. Something like that might also motivate me to keep my mouth shut. This is a bad poster child for free speech, so I'm going to keep my mouth shut about that one. And so, again, there could be reasons why faculty keep their mouth shut, even if in principle they could maybe be brought around to seeing things your way. Left myself some notes, but of course I can't read them anymore. Anyway, so that brings me to the responses. Again, the responses are tailored to the different types. So for administrators, there may be times when there's nothing effective that you can say, especially if you're untenured. But even if you're tenured, sometimes, administrators may just not care what you think at all. But remember, many administrators aren't ideologically opposed to free speech or anything at all, but they're responding to particular incentives. So one thing that you can do is actually appeal to the principles of the matter, not just in a personal conversation, because that's not going to be helpful at all, but in some sort of quasi-public conversation, an all-campus email in which the relevant administrator is CC'd on the thread, in which you make a public appeal to the academic values which the larger community might expect that dean to uphold. This can sort of, for lack of a better word, shame them into doing the right thing. But alternatively, to the extent that they're purely incentive-driven, you can demonstrate counter-incentives, right? They're acting the way they are perhaps because they're afraid of bad press, but it's also bad press if it seems like the university is now anti-freedom of expression, or if the university is somehow anti-academic freedom, that's actually bad press too. Never mind the principles of it, that's the sort of thing you don't want to see in the local paper. And push comes to shove, of course, there's litigation. Administrators don't want to be the targets of litigation. So, if you've got, fire on speed dial, then you can say, look, I don't want to have to call in the lawyers, but if you're insisting on violating my constitutional rights, then I'm going to have to do that. And that's the thing that speaks to even the non-ideological administrators, but the purely incentive-driven, career-oriented administrators will, in fact, respond to threats of bad press or litigation. For students, well, because they're students, it's a potential teachable moment. You can try to explain the nature of their situation. Like, why are you in college in the first place? Presumably there's something about getting an education that presupposes you don't already know everything. It's possible that you could benefit from a free exchange of ideas with your classmates, and fairness might be something that would work. And some students are receptive to these sorts of teachable moment sorts of things. I actually now do a little free speech presentation at freshman orientation. So the new students come in and I actually talk about these issues with them right off the get-go, and talking about, like, why is freedom of speech a good thing for you as a college freshman to have? And some of them actually do get into this. I should also clarify, students at my particular institution are not nearly as savage about some of these cancel culture type issues as I know happens at some of your institutions, perhaps. Another option is getting them to see their own anti-fragility. That's another heightened Lukianoff expression. But the idea is that it's better, you can get them to see why it's better for them to be a little bit uncomfortable sometimes. If you can get them to see that as part of what it means to be in college, why it's good for you to go to college in the first place, that can sometimes work. The other thing, though, that's super helpful with the more zealot-like students is demonstrating to them what the unintended consequences of adopting the rules that they think they want are going to be. And I'll elaborate on that in a sec, because this is also true for our faculty colleagues who don't get it. They may not fully recognize the unintended consequences of their anti-free speech stance, namely, what happens when the shoe's on the other foot. And as it happens, the shoe, like, is on the other foot now, right? When I first got this position 3 years ago, talking about free speech and viewpoint diversity and academic freedom, sort of vaguely right-wing coded by the modal progressive faculty member. But now we see that Republicans are in power and they're cracking down on free speech in a different way. And so when I can say the exact same thing to the exact same colleagues, but then all of a sudden it's not vaguely right-wing coded anymore. It now seems like, oh, this is liberal stuff. He's good. And it's really amazing how people, faculty colleagues, who 3 years ago were giving me some side-eye for adopting this free speech, viewpoint diversity sort of position as a public thing, now say to me things, I'm not exaggerating, I'm so glad you're doing this really important work right now. It's like, okay, I mean, I wish you'd said that 3 years ago, but welcome aboard anyway, better late than never. So the shoe really is on the other foot, and both with students and with faculty, you can say, look, if the rule is whoever shouts the loudest gets their way, that's not going to work out for you in the long run. If the rule is we can bully people with dissident views into submission, that's not going to work out for you either. So that helps. And the other option with your fellow faculty colleagues is, again, inviting public discussion of what education really is. Their role as educators really is not compatible with dogmatism and proselytizing. If the way you teach your class points to one and only one correct answer or correct interpretation, that's probably not the best pedagogy. And again, these are sort of public conversations, all faculty emails or at a discussion group or something like this. Students can't learn if they can't entertain contrasting views. Again, they're anti-fragile, but also just on a purely intellectual level. If they don't learn how to entertain competing views, then they can't actually learn whatever it is they're in college to learn in the first place. And so, I think it's possible to get students to understand that. It should certainly be possible to get your fellow faculty members to understand that. And for the I'm with you in spirit colleagues, you can ask them to consider going public. I've done that, and sometimes they do. Like, sometimes I'll say, would you consider, like, whatever you just sent to me privately, would you consider sending that to the all faculty email list? I think other people would benefit from hearing your story or your perspective. Sometimes they say yes, sometimes they don't. Then I can ask them, would you mind if I said, anonymously, one of my anonymous colleagues said the following, and can I do that? And sometimes they'll say that. And if they're in a vulnerable position, that's sometimes understandable that they might prefer you to handle it that way. But leading by example, of course, weirdly enough, I was sort of a loudmouth about stuff, like even when I was untenured, but amazingly managed to make it this far. But now it's like literally the sort of thing that I'm expected to do, and so I'll jump on and say something now, and I think more people jump in than used to jump in, which is good. And you can't shame everybody, but you can shame some people into doing the right thing, and then that's worth doing. But the other thing to keep in mind is that it's not always about whether people are acting sufficiently principled or not, but it's also a matter of understanding the incentives that they face and looking at ways to make them think about that in a different way and respond differently to the situation. So thanks for listening. I guess we're doing Q&A at the end of all 3 talks, but there's my email address if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Okay. I want to start with an anecdote. So when I was younger, I really liked math. And then my 2 boys are studying like physics and computer science. But then I realized that, politics is actually more important, it's more foundational. And to give an example, a country that's really good at math is North Korea. It's a powerhouse. And it's ranked number 26 in the world with more gold medals per capita than most European countries. But you don't see a lot of human flourishing in North Korea, right? And so, again, because math is great, politics sucks. And so that's why I became a political scientist. Now, imagine 3 variables, okay? And so the first, the title of my paper is Comfort Women and Communist Spies, Human Rights Narratives on the Korean Peninsula. So I'm looking at different human rights narratives, and it's driven by 3 variables. The first one is political ideology, left and right. And just like Americans, conservatives and progressives in Korea divide on how you interpret history, the past. So conservatives feel our founding presidents, Lee Seung-man, Park Chung-hee, they were anti-communist. That was a good thing. And so, anti-communism is good, communism is bad, and communists, North Korea, China, and their collaborators in South Korea are enemies of freedom. Okay, I'm gonna keep on talking while you work on this. Okay, on the other hand, progressives view opposite. They think the founding presidents were bad, that they were staffed by Japanese collaborators, supported by the US imperial occupation. So for progressives, the enemy of freedom is not communism, it's colonialism, imperialism. Okay. Okay, great. Can you make it a little bit bigger? Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Okay, great. So here's to low tech. Yay, MS Word. Okay, back good old 1990s. Okay, so I talked about progressives. Now, that's the first variable. This political ideology. The second variable is even among left and right, there's an internal division between what is the relationship between liberal procedural rights and norms, procedure, versus substantive outcomes, substantive rights. So people who are like million liberals, we are positive sum liberals that believes that upholding procedural rights, such as free speech, and procedural norms, such as objective scholarship, advances substantive rights. So fair procedure, liberal procedure leads to liberal outcomes. On the other hand, you have people like Marcuse and Jeremy Waldron who argues the zero-sum perspective, that no, that some forms of liberal procedural rights and norms can be used to harm democratic institutions and victims' rights. So there can be a zero-sum relationship between liberal procedure and substance and substantive rights. The third variable is the information pedagogical. What is an institutional outlet? Do you express your narrative in the mainstream, such as APSA or the New York Times, or alternative outlets? So 3 variables. And then, which goes to my 3 propositions, that political conservatives support narratives that says, communism is bad, progressives, colonialism is bad. Okay? Number 2, this is important to the extent that one party combines zero-sum ideology with institutional dominance. It should marginalize alternative narratives, pushing alternative producers to outside outlets. And then 3, to the extent that zero-sum liberals marginalize alternative narratives, positive-sum liberals, such as Heterodox Academy, we push a third narrative that highlights, criticizes all restrictions on procedural rights and norms, both hard restrictions, job terminations, entry bans, imprisonment, and soft restrictions, deplatforming and basically not hiring, publishing, or tending those bad people. So that leads to 3 human rights narratives on, I need to lock this. 3 human rights narratives on the Korean Peninsula. So the first narrative is a conservative supported that communist North Korea and China, they violate human rights, including that of Christians and defectors. They make many claims, some supported, some not so supported. One claim was that this one person testified before the US Senate that North Korean security agents were killing Christian prisoners by pouring molten iron on them one by one. This was an official US Senate hearing. Okay, sounds very dramatic. Okay, and so this is an evil regime, and anybody who supports North Korea are also evil. Okay, and anybody who criticizes her testimony are also evil. They're collaborators of the North Korean regime. Now, narrative number 2. You think communism is bad. Colonialism was worse. That the Japanese army, they kidnapped 70 to 200,000 comfort women to become sexual slaves. Okay, and only 1 or 2% came back. They did that, and they also bombed North Korea. They bombed every city and town, causing tremendous trauma. And then also after 1945, you had a series of authoritarian governments. For example, in my hometown, Gwangju, they suppressed peaceful protesters. Okay, so that's the progressive narrative. And then the third narrative is, people like me, Heterodox Academy, which argues that zero-sum liberals, both left and right, repress procedural rights and norms. So you have conservatives who censor anything that sounds like pro-communist, and you deport them and you imprison them. And then progressives, they want to hey, we want to match you. And so recently progressives are doing the same thing. So in 2017, a professor claimed that some Korean women may have volunteered. They signed contracts to become comfort women. He was fired and imprisoned for 6 months. Professor Park Yu-ha published a book on this topic, and she was fined 90 million won, $70,000, and prosecutors wanted her in prison for 3 years. And so she was on trial for the past 10 years, and she was only acquitted last year. And then there's other examples too. But it's not just comfort women. Also, you cannot also say that North Koreans were involved in any of the democratic uprisings because you're defaming the democracy protesters. We passed, and so Jiman Wan, he claimed that North Koreans were involved, so he was in prison for 2 years. And to prevent future Jiman Wans, the progressive government passed a law, the 518 law, May 18 law, that says you can be imprisoned by up to 5 years for saying false and harmful things about the past democracy movements. Okay, now, institutional dynamics. For North Korea, we see increasing institutional symmetry, where you can say different things, whatever you want about, you have competing narratives about North Korea. And so, the conservative narrative is that North Korea is really bad, soldiers are evil, but then now you have a progressive counter narrative. Does anyone watch K-drama? Okay, who watches Netflix? Okay, Netflix fans, yay! Netflix is a progressive counter narrative. So Netflix, they made a Crash Landing on You. And so instead of evil North Korean soldiers, now you have really handsome North Korean soldiers, very tall, who saves, a poor woman she flew a balloon and crash landed in North Korea. Okay? So it's like the humanizing the North Korean military. But for colonialism, and post-colonial South Korea, you have this asymmetry where one side dominates the mainstream institutions. So the progressive narrative dominates mainstream institutions, including fictional portrayals that demonize colonial and South Korean soldiers. Like these are all either Netflix or like Pachinko, which is Apple Plus. There's no Netflix or Apple or any mainstream like drama or that portrays like Japanese soldiers or the post-1945 South Korean soldiers in a positive way. It just doesn't exist. Okay. The counter-narrative, the conservative counter-narrative and critiques of comfort women testimonies tends to be legally prosecuted and marginalized to alternative outlets. So like basically alternative media. Okay. And so most mainstream institutions ignore the counter-narrative that there is a long history of government involvement in sex work before and after Japanese colonialism. But where can you find this counter-narrative? It's not in the mainstream media. You have to go to Facebook, yay! Where you see many suppressed information and fake information. So if you go to Facebook, you can see like documented, right? So these are actual pictures, photographs of the U.S. military and comfort women who served the U.S. military after 1945. And so you don't see this in any Korean newspaper. You have to go to alternative and social media. Okay, and the New York Times actually reported in 2000s when a sociologist named Kim began reporting on the South Korean government's exploitation of women in comfort stations, the government sealed the military records. They feared that Japan's right wing would use it to help whitewash its own comfort women history. So it's become very like politicized. Okay. Now, and this leads to these kind of bubbles. You have both progressive bubbles about comfort women, and also you have conservative bubbles that like communists are everywhere, and they influence the last election, and that actually influenced the past President Yoon, to declare martial law, because he was listening to too much like alternative social media, and he actually believed. Okay, now, so people like me who push for more like open discussion, it's very difficult because we're painted as like, oh, you're platforming the far right. And so the interesting thing is like we write for newspapers and journals, but sometimes we're accepted, sometimes we're published, and sometimes we're not. And the interesting thing is like, like this one journal, like they rejected us, but they published our critics. They're saying like, ooh, okay. So that was fun. Okay. So okay, now conclusion. Both conservatives and progressives weaponize human rights. You have both symmetric and asymmetric polarization. And then power, that I think academics, especially political scientists, should be sensitive to the use and abuse of power. We want to know, so we want to teach our students that those with power are recognized, and they're socially visible. Those without power are invisible. So comfort women for the Japanese military are very visible. They appear on Netflix. Those comfort women for the US military are invisible. They're just on Facebook. Okay. Likewise, you can do an analogy. You see a lot of North American land statements, right? Like Indian tribes. But they only recognize indigenous tribes who were violated by white invaders. They don't recognize any of the earlier tribes who were violated by later tribes. And so again, those who have power are recognized by the land statements. Those without power are never mentioned by land statements. Okay. And so, but I think in this context, so like Heterodox Academy, we struggle to promote procedural rights and norms in asymmetric contexts. And we want to, I think our role is to provide quality control. There's lots of information out there, both true and fake, and I think we want to maintain our reputation as like, integrity. We're not right or left. We're not woke or anti-woke, okay? We are academics, nerdy people, okay? And so we're here to promote, like I said, we're here to find the truth, tell the truth, and and when we're wrong, we want to recognize when we're wrong. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you. All right. Okay, I'm back to my moderator hat. So we have about 25 minutes for Q&A. Okay, I see a lot of hands. Quentin, can we do 2 questions at a time? Yeah, from 2 people at a time? Okay. Your names, can you stand up? Your name and affiliation, sir?
Something about roles I never quite understood, so maybe you could help with respect to this question of epistemic humility. Because I'm wondering why it is that the burden of judgment can't be kind of turned inward on this whole way of thinking. That there's this distinction between comprehensive doctrines as to which we're supposed to be in some way agnostic, and then there's an overlapping consensus of reasonable worldviews, which gives us the basis for the principles of justice. But why doesn't epistemic humility apply equally to the latter, what count as reasonable worldviews for one thing, but also in terms of the interpretation of the principles of justice, why doesn't Marcuse's critique then become just as plausible as the Millian approach in trying to discern how to refine the principles of justice?
Okay.
Can I answer that now?
Actually, sure, go ahead.
Okay.
Sure.
So I guess the first thing to say is I'm not defending Rawls's entire theory. That's not what I'm aiming to do, because I think there's some force in that point, which is called the asymmetry argument. Why doesn't this just apply to the theory of justice itself, right? Our beliefs about justice, also are subject to the same burdens of judgment. That seems true. But with regards to this specific issue of free speech, of which academic freedom is a type, I think that the asymmetry argument doesn't work. So we can say, well, okay, but our whole rationale for believing that we have burdens of judgment is itself subject to burdens of judgment. You can do that meta move, that second order move, and that might be true, but what's supposed to follow from that? Well, if because we're not certain whether we're certain, we're supposed to act as if we're certain and take the Marcuse view, that seems like a really bad solution to this meta-level uncertainty. That seems like it just collapses back into thinking we can act as if we're certain about the human good. And so the Marcuse solution, the authoritarian solution, I don't think takes any support from this asymmetry. Does that answer your question?
Not to my satisfaction, but I won't debate it.
Yes, next. Stand up, your name and affiliation.
I'm David McCabe. I'm from Colgate University. I also have a question for Jacob. So I really like to talk. Thanks a lot. I just wonder about the I just didn't totally understand the connections between the claims about freedom and then the claims about academic freedom. So I wonder if you could say a little more. Because as I remember Mill, there's a chapter on liberty, thought, and discussion, and there's a chapter on individuality as one of the elements of. And the individuality chapter, Experiments of Living, is kind of clearly depending, I think, on this progressive view of human flourishing. But I don't see the chapter on liberty, thought, and discussion as being similarly dependent. I think you can sort of see this if you think about the Catholic Church, who appoint the devil's advocate and they don't have the Millian view of flourishing. So why think that the case for academic freedom has to hinge in a problematic way on the Millian, more modern view of flourishing? Or maybe I just didn't understand what you were.
Sure. So, okay. So the case that Mill actually relies on this progressive view of flourishing, even in his case for free speech, is the one made by Maurice Cowling, which I could reconstruct in detail. He appeals to other writings of Mill's in which he discusses, I think it's his essay on Coleridge, where he discusses things like the national clerisy. Now, I'm not really committed to a view either way as to whether Cowling is correct about this dependency existing in Mill's thought, because I think it's tangential in the sense that what we can say is, well, there are some arguments for academic freedom being invoked that are linked to the name of Mill in kind of popular discourse, in semi-academic discourse that are floating around everywhere. And so the post-liberal critique has force with respect to those arguments, irrespective of whether or not anyone's interpretation of Mill is true to the real Mill.
Okay, thank you.
Frank Locking, Heterodox Academy, also a visiting scholar at Harvard. Turns out that Mark Ramsire, who you mentioned, happens to be a CAFH member, Council on Academic Freedom, and he comments on other things. So it's unclear that he's a right-wing researcher or not. I really have no independent opinion, but happen to know him from the CAFH. Once, of course, I asked him about this controversy, and he said he was just doing good old scholarly research as a Harvard Law School professor and found contracts. So do you have any comments just out of curiosity? Is he a right-wing advocate, or is he a scholarly researcher who got maligned and demonized? So, which is probably his view. I'm just curious.
Well, it's hard to say because I'm not a historian. But then I remember he's like, I think he's partly the reason why I don't have a tenure job in Korea. Like a fun story is that, so I've been so I got interested because in 2012, I have a lot of international students in Korea, and one's Japanese, and she was harassed on the subway because she was Japanese. And so I became very interested in this issue, and I discussed difficult issues like comfort women in my class. And I got some pushback from students. But then in 2021, Mark Ramsire wrote an article saying that, yeah, most women were not kidnapped, using Chicago economic theory. Most women sign contracts, and women receive more, their contracts, they offer more money during wartime than peacetime. Okay, using Chicago economic theory. So when I read this, I thought, oh, that's interesting. I wonder if it's true. Okay. But we didn't have that debate, whether it was true. A lot of the debate was is he an evil pedophile or far-right denialist, for supporting prostitution among 11-year-olds. So I thought this was very distracting. I wanted academic debate. I wanted to know he made a claim, is it true? Okay, and so I've been and so I wrote an essay in the Diplomat saying, instead of denouncing Ramsire, let's debate him. And this caused huge blowback. And then 1,500 students petitioned to terminate me. And then all my publications about North Korea, LGBT, they were recognized by the university. And anyway, so the bottom line is that I'm become persona non grata. But I think from a Millian perspective, I think freedom of conscience is very important. That I think the cost of speaking out is high, but the cost of not speaking out is higher. Right? Just to roundabout answer. Right? So as for Ramsire, I'm not 100% sure. He seems like a nice guy, and then in his favor, I told him come to the forum. I'm gonna invite all your critics. And he said, okay. So he came, I invited all these critics, and they didn't come, right? And so I had to, I think one of the speakers, talked about using ChatGPT to, imitate his critics. So I'm thinking maybe I'll do that in the future, right? Right. So, okay.
Just a follow-up note on that. When his article came out first, and then the book came out, East Asian studies in the United States went nuts.
Right.
Over it, and he's a law professor, right? Interested in contracts, and so he wasn't coming. Has that just gone away though now? Is it there's no debate that just got suppressed? What's the state of the debate over the comfort women issue at this point?
Oh, we just don't talk about it. You're right. So.
Well, that solves everything.
Right. So the university took away all my students that require classes. The university took them away. So I don't teach research methods to undergrads anymore. I still teach to grad students because they're too old. They don't demonstrate that much, right? So it's kind of I call this bounded voice. So I'm still there. I'm still exercising voice, but I have to compromise. Okay, let's move on.
Hi, my name is Holly Hamilton Bleakley. I'm from the University of San Diego. Thank you, everyone. And Jacob, this is mostly for you. I'm actually working on a chapter right now about Mill's theory of free speech for a larger project. Yeah, I think Mill's kind of muddled, right? He's got the teleological elements, but he also does have the deontological elements, I think, in his theory. I mean, yeah, these are all sorts of interpretations, but yeah, he does go for this thing that, you know, freedom of speech is going to lead to flourishing of the human nature because it is going to help bring out the truth. But at the same time, he also wants to have this very strict, like, freedom of conscience no matter what, freedom of association no matter what, right? Freedom of thought no matter what. And then freedom of speech is just an extension of freedom of thought for him. So, I don't know, I just don't really agree with Patrick Denon's interpretation of that connection between Mill and Marcuse, I guess. I just think there's way too much ambiguity and different moving parts in Mill's argument to make that straight line to Marcuse. I don't know if you want to... I couldn't really tell from your talk whether or not you thought, whether you agreed with the line from Mill to Marcuse.
So I'm not a Mill scholar, and I don't want to take a position on that like historical thing. I guess the main purpose of bringing this up is to say, well, a lot of the arguments out there that appeal to ideas that we find in Mill might well be vulnerable to this complaint that they rest on this progressive conception of flourishing. So it's not so much to say this is a problem in Mill, it's to say they've made this claim about certain arguments for academic freedom, which invoke Mill, and it's valid with respect to some of those claims. So it's not really about the historical stuff.
Okay.
Who's up next? Hi, question for this first speaker. I took the point to be that what you ultimately wanted to do was ground academic freedom in this sort of fallibilism and uncertainty stuff. But that's just one arm of Mill's main argument. And the other arm is when he says, well, look, even if you are absolutely certain that your position is correct, you should still engage with the contrarian, because that's how you get this, richer understanding, the clearer perception and livelier impression of the truth, and so on. So my question is, well, don't you need the other arm too? Because just as there are people that don't accept a certain set of political values, there are people that don't accept their own fallibility, especially when it concerns fundamental things like who's a person and so on. I don't think you could just do it with the fallibility stuff. Am I right about that or not?
I definitely agree you need both arms, and even when we have a sense of certainty, of subjective certainty, that, yeah, we absolutely need the critics in order to be genuinely justified in our own beliefs, and that's completely right. I think there's a weaker sense in which that still relies on a kind of fallibilism. If you think that your subjective certainty means that you can't benefit from listening to interlocutors, if you think that anyone who disagrees must be acting out of evil motives, must be a bigot, etc., and therefore there's no value in discourse, well, that kind of really strong infallibilism would also go against that other arm. So in a sense, fallibilism plays into both arms.
Who else?
I might like to argue that we're giving everyone too much credit, and that there isn't the high thought, like, Ian, you gave us this framework, that it's more personal, more interpersonal than it is, high crimes and misdemeanors. And I just wonder how each of you might respond to that. So take it back down to boots on the ground instead of arguing from these higher sort of order perspectives.
Sure. Your name and affiliation?
I'm Elizabeth from Bridgewater State, as a matter of fact.
Oh, great.
I mean, make sure I understand what you're asking. Like, obviously, people, like, if someone already doesn't like someone, then of course they're going to be hostile to that person's rights. Of course that's true. But that can't explain all of the opposition to free speech. Because often, like, student mobs, like, they don't necessarily know the person personally, but they know what the person's supposed to come to campus to give a talk about, and that's what they're all riled up about. So, I mean, of course, you know of cases where someone's personal dislike leads to their rights being violated, but I think that's overall a minority of cases. I think it's, administrators want to keep their heads down and avoid trouble. Students are going to scream about whatever they're going to scream about, and that's often not personality driven, although I certainly wouldn't deny that that plays a role. I think it's more likely, though, that what that ends up doing is exacerbating the underlying problem. But in lots of cases, it's not personal. It's you're saying something that's heretical, and I am of a disposition that I can't tolerate heretical thoughts. And there's lots of people who are like that, even when it's not personal. Making it personal, of course, just makes that worse. I don't know if I'm responding or not.
So just very briefly then, with regards to whether we're giving people too much credit and attaching too much weight to the sincerity of their ideas, I try not to, as it were, make windows into men's souls. I don't claim to know if the post-liberals are sincere in their beliefs or not, or that's the motivating factor behind their views on academic freedom. I think it's important to have a view on the arguments they make, regardless of the motives of who's making them. So that's the approach I try to take.
I really agree what you're stressed on the interpersonal relations. I think too many times we demonize each other. And I think, like, for example, like Professor Mark Ramsier, he was kind of stereotyped as this, like, privileged, white guy, okay? From, like, a Harvard law professor. But if but then for me, it's like, the interesting thing is that he's what do you call it? He's an MK. He's a missionary kid from Japan, right? So his parents not rich. He actually went to a small Christian school for college. And then, but later but his advisor told him, like, why don't you go to Michigan for grad school? So he went to Michigan, got good grades. Then he went to Harvard Law School, and then, right. But he didn't have, like, that, really privileged, like, origins. So I think by getting to know him personally, like, maybe I don't fully know, like, your evidence, but I think I can connect with you on a personal level, right? Okay.
So, Professor Williams, you mentioned that the integralists want to bring back blasphemy laws. They would say, actually, we do have blasphemy laws today. And they would say, try burning a pride flag and see what happens. You actually, for the whole panel, would you agree with them on that?
So this is the no alternatives argument, that we're going to have progressive authoritarianism if we don't have official blasphemy laws. And I think that there's a weak version of their claim, which is very plausible, which is we do live in a society in which, as you said the other day, you try asking social and religious conservatives about authoritarianism, they feel they've been living under that for a long time. Often they're very warranted in doing so, but there are degrees of authoritarianism. There are degrees to which this is structural and inevitable, as opposed to something more contingent that can be fought within the boundaries of at least a minimally liberal society. And I take the optimistic view that we can fight to preserve at least basic civil liberties, and then have a bigger sort of range of questions that we can just fight it out within the democratic process about, and that we can move towards a society that's less coercive to religious traditionalists without necessarily creating equal and opposite coercion of the other side.
Quick follow-up, too. I don't think it's really analogous. Like, the kind of social scorn that you might be met with if you burnt a pride flag is not at all analogous to an actual blasphemy law in which you get sent to prison for having said the wrong thing. This is Iranian stuff, right? It's publish a novel and then they get literal death warrants, price on my head sort of thing. So it's not burning a pride flag might get you some side eye or some angry letters to the editor or something, but it's not going to get you a literal government death edict. I don't think that's really that's too much of a false equivalence, I think.
I actually think that there are some laws on the books regarding certain forms of hate that they would see as and also legislative issues of students who have the administration come down
Oh, sure, but but all the millions in the room are opposed to that kind of punishment for your thoughts, whether it comes from the left or the right.
Right, both legally and socially. Right. I think it goes back to Jonathan Rauch, right? That no statement should be made sacred or or sacrilegious. And so I think it's really important to establish, reestablish that norm among students. We need to fight for procedural liberalism. Okay, maybe time for one more question or a couple more. Oh, I see a hand up front. Your name and where you're from, sir?
Hi, I'm Nikos, and I'm an undergrad at Columbia.
Okay.
So, Professor Yi, you mentioned that the undergrads care too much, and I generally find that to be true, actually. So I guess this is also sort of like a question for everyone, which is, first of all, do you think that it's a global phenomenon where undergrads generally care too much? And then also, how can we balance maybe the very real cares and consideration and activism that young people have? How can we balance that against intellectualism and just talking and fostering an open environment that we do also urgently need?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Who was that for?
It was for all of us.
Oh.
Yeah, all of us.
So about how can we move towards a society given the sort of state of undergrads, and how can we manage that?
Yeah, your advice to undergrads who want to be activists.
I mean, I think try to embrace fallibilism is what I'd say to undergrads. You don't know very much. I mean, none of us do, but undergrads especially, that's the whole point. So you recognize how little you know and try to have some humility and know that applies not just to technical things or things you're explicitly studying, but to these big questions that you're taking views on in your activism as well. So have that humility.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I was getting. College students often feel passionate about things, and that's good, but you need to combine that with open-mindedness. And again, the whole point of being in college is to learn new things. So whatever you grew up thinking, I don't know, some of that stuff's true, and maybe some of it's not true, and the only way to find out is to entertain discussion with other people. So I would say, advance your causes, whatever they are, but don't do so in a way that violates other students' rights to say the opposite thing, and don't turn opposition to your view into you're a horrible human being and I want to kill you now. That's the mistake to avoid, I think.
Right. I think activism is great, but I think you have an ethical duty to be a smart one. And I really before poli-sci PhD, I was going to go to law school, and I really liked, for example, Yale Law School, right? The best lawyers understand, empathize with the other side, right? So I think the best activists understand complexity and just understand how the complex world works. So the activists that at Columbia, do they see complexity, or are they more on the simplified side?
I mean, so I didn't necessarily want to only focus on activists. I think generally undergrads, at least on my campus, all tend to have this sort of very activistic mentality.
Sure.
Even many that will claim to be involved in the free speech movement will always see the world in the sense of black and white and good and evil, and I disagree with this person. Maybe this person isn't totally committed to free speech, for example. Therefore, we must oppose them, which is totally analogous to what it should be. I'd say that at Columbia, yes, definitely. I mean, this is what we see in the news all the time, and from both sides.
That's fine. Then I think it'd be your ethical duty to share and teach your fellow students to look at the world in a more complicated way. So good luck. Okay. Yes. Thank you. Right. Okay. Okay. Do we have any other, we have 2 minutes. Do we have any other question or comment? Oh, did you have a question? No?
No, I mean, that's kind of what I was getting at too, is but this, appealing to these higher order, great and magnificent goals doesn't always resonate with individuals.
Right, exactly.
And we sometimes maybe we're giving people too much credit. Oh, here's why you're in college. No, I'm in college because I don't know what else to do right now, so I'm going to go to college for a while.
Sure.
And so,
Anyway, so be friendly and then ethical. Thank you very much. Okay? All right. Thank you, guys.